Welcome now, everyone, to PressTV's news review program, where we get in-depth in one of the day's top stories. Beijing has condemned a recent anti-China statement issued by the U.S. and the European Union. Have a listen.
The relevant content of the EU-US summit statement was far beyond the normal scope of development for bilateral relations. It was condescending and pointing fingers at China's domestic affairs. It has unreasonably interfered in China's internal affairs, was full of reckless smearing and denunciations, and manufactured and spread misinformation. China expresses strong dissatisfaction and is firmly opposed to this.
Foreign Ministry spokesman said that China strongly opposes any country that seeks to impose its demands on other nations. On Tuesday, the U.S. and EU agreed to a long-term truce in their dispute over subsidies to plane makers Boeing and Airbus. A statement said the suspension will allow both parties to focus on tackling China's trade and economic practices. Joining us now for the program is Frank Emspak, Emeritus Professor out of the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Ramiro Fuentes, political commentator, joining us from Los Angeles. Gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you both to the program. Frank, we're going to start with you. Good to have you back to join us here and get your input on this. Your thoughts on the story, who's in the right, the U.S. and the European Union or Beijing?
Well, I think the papers are very clear and the Chinese are very clear that it was pretty hypocritical for the United States to try to organize the Europeans against the Chinese. Let's be serious here. We are in the Western Pacific. The United States has fleets and everything else off the Chinese coast because we won World War II vis-a-vis the Japanese and replaced them in the Western Pacific. The Chinese are the second largest economy, if not the first economy in the world. The major U.S. corporations, for instance, GE and the French partner Safran, are the supplier of jet engines to the new Chinese domestic airline industry. The General Electric company cannot, nor can the French, lose that. The Germans' machine tool industry is dependent upon the Chinese. So there is something going on here that's very serious. But one thing that we should keep in mind is that it was easy to try to push around the Russians or other people after World War II. Their country was devastated. But it's another thing with the Chinese at this point. And I think that what's happening here is a very, very dangerous situation because it is being set up as if it was a Cold War, that the Chinese are the problem. And for the United States to do that when we have such massive internal problems, as well as this huge defense budget, what are we going to do here? We cannot do both. And I think it's a dangerous road to go down to try to say that everything that's going on in China is bad and that we're fine, because that's simply not the case, and people don't believe it. And it undermines a certain economic growth both here and in Europe. And in that regard, there's going to be, I think, major conflicts internally.
Thank you, Frank. And Ramiro, I'd like to welcome you to the program there. Joining us from Los Angeles is Mr. Ramiro Fuentes. Ramiro, your thoughts, to Frank's point, from textiles to technology and everything in between, we depend a lot, the whole world does, in fact, the U.S. and the European Union, especially on Chinese products. So what's going on?
I'm in total agreement with Frank. He's exactly spot on in terms of the dependence of the global economy on China. And it's important to note that this is nothing new. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. If we look at the early 1800s, you had a situation where the United States and Europe and the Western powers weren't as strong. And in China, that was building itself up, that was trading silk, that was trading different commodities and had the Silk Road, the British and the French wanted to control that market. They didn't want to see China prosper. And so the British launched the Opium Wars twice in the 1800s. They forced the country to import drugs that were cultivated in southern India and were then imported to China. They wanted to subjugate the Chinese people to the British mercantile system. And so the 1800s was known, and is still known today in China, as the century of humiliation. And that is exactly what the United States and the G7 Western imperialist countries would like to see today in China. They would like to see another century of humiliation for China. They would like to see its population succumb to Western imperialism. And China's not going to let that happen. China is trading successfully with Central Asian countries, with Iran, with Venezuela, with Cuba, with Nicaragua, with countries all over the world, is creating an alternative to Western imperialism. And these countries, the G7 countries, are very scared of that, of any sort of independence. And this is something that we have to look at history and understand how the Western imperialists have acted, why they're doing so. And it does come from a position of fear, because they know that once their grip on global power is gone, they leave room for other powers to rise. And I think that's exactly what's happening.
Thanks, sir, Ramiro. And Frank, I'm glad Ramiro went into what they'd like to see and what they'd like to see, repeated that a couple times. To that point, what do you think the U.S. and the European Union want to see from China? Because if it's going to be any kind of image that basically mimics them, you're not going to any longer get, your Nikes from them for, $5 or $10 a pop wholesale. You're not going to get your Ford parts and your Fords made over there for, 20, 22 grand, so you can sell them for 35. I mean, if Americans don't want to pay, 70 grand for an F-150 and maybe 200 grand for an F-650, then perhaps you might want to take it easy on China. What does the U.S., what kind of character do they want to see in the Chinese government that's so pressing for them?
Well, I don't know that what the United States wants to see in China is possible, for the reasons that the prior speaker just said. The Chinese have made it abundantly clear they want to advance their civilization, they want to advance their standard of living, and want to be equal to or greater than anybody else on the planet. And I think the fact of the matter is they have the capacity to do so. What's unsettling for the United States is that we've been in that seat for a while and have no idea how to share power in a certain sense. It's just not part of the thinking here. And I think that's what's so dangerous, because what we see is, from the Han Dynasty point of view, from their point of view, they call the period 1800 to 1950 as an interregnum. And they say that we've been here, for 4,500 years, and we were the major economy in the world for about 2,000 years, and we expect to come back, and they've been very clear about that. And I think that we, on the other hand, are faced with major internal problems. We may have come to the end of the line with capitalism, which is actually pretty new, relatively speaking, compared to, say, the Chinese civilization. And there is no way out here. You cannot. I don't believe it's possible for the Western Europe and the United States to dominate China. Let's try this just as one example. I know we are out of time here. The Chinese, about 2 years ago, started this rail link between the middle of China and the middle of Germany. And in Trier we're in one place it stops in Belgium. And it was a big deal to have one train a week. Now they do 10 a day. But think about that. All across the whole continent. 10 trains a day, a massive amount of stuff, a huge investment. Well, this isn't going to go away. And I think that the Europeans are stuck between the United States and China. And they're going to have to decide if they want to have a world where it's possible for two powers to work with each other, or throw in their lot with, say, the United States. And I don't think it's going to be so easy for Biden and others to say, we're back, we're in charge, follow us. I don't see that working out too well for the United States in the long run, or most people at all.
Well, we've seen time and again also, Frank, that the U.S. punishes the Europeans when they don't follow what it wants them to follow.
There's a limit to that, and I think we've reached it. You can push people around, but you then have a situation, particularly when there's a competing and possible economic out. You can't tell the Germans to give up their entire machine tool industry because we want to be in charge. It isn't going to work that way. We're not prepared to say to Germany, as we did after World War II, we'll pick up the tab. We can't do that right now.
Yeah, the Germans are already fighting back, and the Germans are already fighting back on the whole Nord Stream 2 with Russia. And to your point, very well said. We are short on time. I'm going to swing over to Ramiro. We have a couple minutes left. Ramiro, your final thoughts, please.
I just want to mention that the Democratic and the Republican Party are both complicit in the new imperialist war and regime change, not only against China and Russia, but against Iran as well. I think that people have a tendency to view the Democrats, at least in the United States, as the party of peace, of anti-war, of combating racism, when in reality, the Democratic Party has been at the forefront of warmongering against Russia, warmongering against China. The Democrats have been complicit in so many coup attempts around the world. And I think what we're going to see is an attempt by the Democrats to try to pin Russia against China. And recently with Biden's meeting with Putin, I think it was a very pathetic attempt to do so. And I think Russia is very solidly in the camp of defending China, of defending other countries of the global South in solidarity with China. And I think the spell of U.S. imperialism is wearing off, just like the other guests mentioned, that China, Russia, Iran, these other countries represent the future of the world. The United States and Europe represents the past. And I think many countries are put in the position now where they're stuck in the middle. Another example is Australia. I think in Australia, you have a rising sector of society that would rather trade with China, would rather join the Belt and Road Initiative instead of cooperating with the U.S. in military exercises for a new war that doesn't produce value. And so just to kind of sum up, the U.S. imperialist system represents the decaying old order, and Chinese constructive socialism represents the new world order.
All right, gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Stay safe, both of you. Frank Emspak, professor, joining us from Madison, Wisconsin, and Ramiro Fenas joining us out of Los Angeles. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for tuning in for this segment of your Press TV's News Review program. Thanks for tuning in, and bye-bye for now.